I still remember the sound of the judge's voice. Not because it was loud. Quite the opposite. It was barely above a whisper. My God, the entire courtroom went silent. My father stopped smiling. His attorney looked as if all the blood had drained from his face. For a moment, nobody moved. The judge stared down at a yellowed document that had been sealed for more than 20 years. Then he looked directly at my father's lawyer. What happened next would destroy everything my family had spent decades trying to hide. The judge slowly set the file on the bench. His eyes never left the attorney. Then he spoke 4 words that nobody in that courtroom expected to hear. "Bailiff, lock the doors." The attorney went pale. My father gripped the edge of the defense table. And for the first time in my 62 years of life, I saw fear in his eyes. But to understand why that happened, I have to take you back to the beginning. My name is Daniel Carter. I was born and raised in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. For most of my life, I believed families were supposed to stand together. My mother certainly believed that. My father didn't, at least not when it came to me. Growing up, I was always the odd one out. My younger brother Michael could do no wrong. If he brought home a report card with a B, Dad took him out for ice cream. If I brought home straight A's, Dad would ask why one of the grades wasn't higher. My sister Rebecca was treated like a princess. Dad helped pay for her college education. When she got married, he paid for the wedding. When Michael joined the family construction business, Dad practically handed him a management position. Me? I worked at a gas station after high school. Then I became a mechanic. I bought my first tools with money I earned changing oil and replacing brakes. I built my life one paycheck at a time. My mother always told me not to let bitterness take root. "Your father has his flaws," she'd say. "Don't let them become yours too." I tried. Lord knows I tried. For years I convinced myself that none of it mattered. I married a wonderful woman named Linda. We raised 2 children. We paid our bills. We lived an honest life. I wasn't rich, but I slept well at night. Then my mother died. Everything changed after that. She passed away from cancer at 78. The disease took her slowly. During her final months, I spent almost every weekend at the hospital. My father rarely stayed longer than an hour. Michael was usually too busy with work. Rebecca lived in Arizona. Most days it was just Mom and me. We talked about old memories, family stories, the grandchildren, simple things. A few weeks before she died, she squeezed my hand and said something that didn't make sense at the time. "One day the truth will matter." I asked her what she meant. She smiled weakly, then changed the subject. At the funeral, my father barely cried. Instead, he spent most of his time talking with his attorney, a man named Charles Whitmore. Whitmore had represented our family for years. He was respected, connected, the kind of lawyer whose name appeared on hospital wings and charity plaques. At the time, I thought nothing of it. A few months later, strange things started happening. Properties that had always been listed under family ownership were suddenly transferred. Trust documents were amended. Ownership records changed. Every time I asked questions, I received vague answers. Then came the letter. I still remember opening it at my kitchen table. According to the document, I had been removed from a family trust that my mother helped establish decades earlier. Removed completely. No explanation. No discussion. Nothing. I thought it had to be a mistake. I called my father. He didn't answer. I called again. And again. Finally, he picked up. "Dad, what is this?" "I assume you're talking about the trust. Mom wanted all of us treated equally." There was a long pause. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. "Your mother isn't here anymore, Daniel." The words hit harder than I expected. What does that mean? It means things change. I remember staring at the phone, trying to understand what I was hearing. "You cut me out." "I made decisions that were best for the family. The family, I'm your son." His voice became cold. "You've always been too emotional." Then he hung up. That night I barely slept. Over the next several weeks, I started digging through public records. What I found disturbed me. Property transfers that didn't make sense. Corporate entities that appeared suddenly. Transactions involving family assets. The deeper I looked, the stranger everything became. I showed the records to Linda. She sat quietly for several minutes. Then she asked a question that changed everything. "Do you think your mother knew?" I didn't answer immediately. Because deep down, I already knew the answer. Mom had seen something. Maybe not all of it. But enough. Enough to worry. Enough to leave clues. Enough to tell me that one day the truth would matter. The problem was proving it. Friends advised me to let it go. "You'll never win against people like that. He's your father. Life's too short." Maybe they were right. But every time I thought about walking away, I remembered my mother's face during those final weeks. I remembered her hand squeezing mine. I remembered her words. One day the truth will matter. Eventually, I hired an attorney, a small-town lawyer named Susan Keller. Nothing flashy, nothing expensive, just honest. After reviewing the records, she leaned back in her chair. "Daniel, something isn't right here." That was the first time a professional had said it out loud. I filed suit. The response was immediate. Family members stopped calling. Neighbors became distant. People assumed I was chasing money. Even Michael refused to speak with me. The closer we got to trial, the more alone I felt. Then came the final blow. 3 weeks before court, my father hired Charles Whitmore to personally lead the defense. The most powerful attorney in the county. The man whose connections seemed endless. The man sitting beside my father on the day everything began to unravel. The trial date was set, and as I walked toward the courthouse on that cold October morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a battle I had already lost. The first few weeks after filing the lawsuit were some of the loneliest of my life. At 62 years old, I thought I understood disappointment. I thought I understood betrayal. What I hadn't expected was how quickly people would choose sides. The moment word spread around town that I was suing my father, opinions formed almost overnight. Some people were polite about it. Others weren't. At the diner where I usually had coffee on Saturdays, conversations would suddenly stop when I walked in. A few old friends told me privately that they thought I was making a mistake. One even said, "Daniel, your father has more money than you'll ever see. He can drag this out until you're broke." Maybe he was right. The legal bills were already piling up. Linda and I weren't wealthy. We lived comfortably, but retirement wasn't far away. Every check written to my attorney felt like a gamble. Some nights I sat awake wondering if I should simply walk away. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered my mother's final words. "One day the truth will matter." The problem was that I still didn't know what truth she had been talking about. One rainy afternoon, nearly 2 months after filing the lawsuit, I was cleaning out boxes in my garage. It was something Linda had been asking me to do for years. Most of the boxes had belonged to Mom. Old family photographs, Christmas decorations, recipe cards, church newsletters. The kind of things people keep because throwing them away feels wrong. I wasn't looking for evidence. I was simply trying to organize things. Then I found the cookbook. It was an old spiral-bound recipe collection Mom used constantly. The cover was worn. Several pages were stained with flour and butter. As I flipped through it, something fell onto the floor. An envelope. My name was written on the front, not typed. Handwritten. Mom's handwriting. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. My heart was pounding. The envelope had never been opened. The seal was intact. I called for Linda. She walked into the garage and immediately noticed my expression. "What is it?" I held up the envelope. She looked at the handwriting, then at me. Neither of us spoke. Slowly, I opened it. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. The note was short, much shorter than I expected. It read, "If you are reading this, I am gone. There are things I could never prove while I was alive. If you ever need answers, contact Judge Harold Benson. Trust him. Love always, Mom." That was it. No explanation. No details. Just a name. Judge Harold Benson. I sat there for several minutes staring at the note. Linda finally broke the silence. "Do you know who he is?" I nodded slowly. Everyone in the county knew who Harold Benson was. He had served as a judge for nearly 30 years before retiring. Respected. Honest. The sort of man whose reputation remained spotless even after decades in public service. But I had never met him personally. As far as I knew, neither had my mother. At least not socially. The next morning I called. To my surprise, Benson answered personally. His voice sounded old but steady. When I mentioned my mother's name, everything changed. There was a long silence. Then he asked me to come see him. Immediately. His home sat on a quiet road outside town. The kind of place where retired people spent afternoons reading on the porch. He greeted me politely, but there was concern in his eyes. After we sat down, I handed him the note. He read it carefully, then sighed. I hoped this day would never come. That sentence immediately got my attention. "What did my mother tell you?" He folded the note and set it aside. "Not enough." "What does that mean?" "It means she was worried. Worried about what?" He leaned back in his chair. For a moment he seemed unsure how much to say. Finally he spoke. "Your mother came to me several years before she died." I felt my pulse quicken. "Why?" "Because she believed certain family records were being altered." The room suddenly felt smaller. "What records?" Property records, trust documents, financial transfers. Exactly what I had been investigating. Benson continued. She wasn't accusing anyone directly, but she was concerned. Did she have proof? Not enough. My shoulders dropped. But she had something else. I looked at him. What? A precaution. The retired judge stood and walked to a bookshelf. After searching briefly, he removed a folder. He returned and placed it on the table. What you're about to hear never left this room while your mother was alive. I nodded. Years earlier, according to Benson, my mother had discovered inconsistencies involving family assets. She feared that if something happened to her, important records might disappear. So she arranged for certain documents to be placed under court protection. Legally sealed. Protected from alteration. Protected from destruction. Protected from anyone who might benefit from making them vanish. I stared at him. Where are these documents now? His expression changed. In county court archives. My heart skipped. You've seen them? No, you haven't. He shook his head. The contents were sealed before filing. Then what's inside? I don't know. For the first time during our conversation, I saw genuine frustration in his face. The purpose wasn't for me to know. The purpose was preservation. The room fell silent. I thought about everything I had discovered. The strange transfers. The trust amendments. The shell companies. Then a question occurred to me. If these documents exist, why hasn't anyone brought them forward? Because nobody knew they mattered. He paused. Until now. As I drove home that evening, hope battled caution inside my mind. For the first time since filing the lawsuit, I felt as though my mother had left me something more valuable than money. A path, a chance, a thread worth following. Over the next several weeks, my attorney filed motions requesting access to archived court materials. The process was slow, painfully slow. Records had to be located. Permissions reviewed. Procedures followed. Meanwhile, the trial date continued approaching. The defense remained confident. Almost too confident. Then something strange happened. During a pretrial conference, I noticed Charles Whitmore. For the first time, he didn't look comfortable. It was only a moment, a brief flash of concern. But I saw it. And once I saw it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if he knew something? What if he knew exactly what was buried in those archives? What if my mother's fears had been justified all along? The trial was now only weeks away. The sealed records still hadn't been located. My father remained confident. The defense continued acting as if victory was inevitable. But somewhere inside a county archive, a forgotten file waited. And none of us yet knew that it was about to change everything. By the time the trial began, I felt as though I had already lived through a year of stress. The courthouse sat in the center of town, a building I had passed thousands of times throughout my life. I'd paid property taxes there, registered vehicles there, voted there. But walking through those doors as a plaintiff suing my own father felt entirely different. Everything suddenly seemed larger, more intimidating, more permanent. On the first morning of trial, Linda squeezed my hand before we entered the courtroom. "You don't have to prove your worth today," she said softly. "You never did." I smiled. But I won't pretend her words erased my fear. The courtroom was already filling when we arrived. People from town had come to watch, some out of curiosity, some because they knew my father, some because small towns rarely pass up a good family dispute. At the defense table sat Richard Carter, my father, 83 years old, still proud, still stubborn, still carrying himself like the most important man in every room. Beside him sat Charles Whitmore, the most respected attorney in the county, at least publicly. Whitmore greeted nearly everyone who entered. Judges, clerks, local officials. He looked completely at ease, like a man attending a routine business meeting, not a man facing allegations involving decades of family assets. When court came to order, the defense immediately established control. Whitmore was good, very good. I hated admitting it, but the man was talented. His opening statement painted a simple picture. A disappointed son, a family disagreement, an elderly father being dragged into court by someone unhappy with inheritance decisions. The story sounded reasonable. That was the problem. The best lies usually contain pieces of truth. Then it was our turn. Susan Keller stood and calmly outlined the evidence. The questionable transfers, the altered records, the unexplained trust amendments. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't use dramatic language. She simply laid out the facts. I could tell she was doing her best. But even then, I felt the uphill battle ahead of us. Over the next several days, witness after witness took the stand. Many of them favored my father. Former employees testified that Richard Carter had always managed family affairs. Business associates described him as trustworthy. Longtime friends praised his generosity. Listening to them was frustrating. Not because they were lying. Most of them genuinely believed what they were saying. The version of my father they knew wasn't entirely fake. Richard Carter could be charming, helpful, generous, especially when people were watching. What they didn't see was the man behind closed doors. The man who measured his children's worth differently. The man who treated affection like a reward to be earned. The man who had spent decades deciding who deserved to belong. One afternoon, Michael took the stand. Seeing my younger brother sworn in was harder than I expected. We hadn't spoken in nearly a year. His eyes barely met mine. Whitmore guided him through a series of questions. Everything went exactly as expected. Michael supported my father's position. He claimed all transfers had been legitimate. All decisions had been discussed. All actions had been legal. Listening to him felt like losing my brother all over again. When Susan cross-examined him, cracks began appearing. Small ones. Subtle ones. Michael couldn't explain certain dates. He couldn't explain why documents appeared years after events supposedly occurred. He couldn't explain inconsistencies in financial records. But uncertainty wasn't enough. Not yet. The defense remained firmly in control. Each evening I returned home exhausted. Linda tried to encourage me, but I could see concern in her eyes. She knew what I knew. We weren't winning, at least not so far. Midway through the trial, Susan invited me to her office after court. She closed the door, then removed her glasses. Never a good sign. "Tell me the truth," I said. She sighed. "The judge is listening." That wasn't an answer. "Susan." She looked directly at me. "We need something stronger." The words landed like a weight on my chest. "What if we don't find it?" She didn't answer immediately. Finally, she said, "Then we may lose." I drove home in silence. The sealed file still hadn't been located. County staff continued searching archives. Boxes. Storage rooms. Old records. Nothing. Every day that passed made me more anxious. Meanwhile, the defense grew increasingly confident. On the second-to-last day of testimony, the worst moment arrived. Court had recessed for lunch. I was standing alone near a hallway window when my father approached. He moved slowly now. Age had taken some of his strength. But not his confidence. Not yet. For several seconds he stood beside me without speaking. Then he chuckled, just like he had on the phone months earlier. "You know, Daniel." I didn't respond. He looked out the window. "No witnesses." His smile widened. "You already lost." Those words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were cruel, because part of me feared he might be right. He patted my shoulder, almost casually, then walked away. I stood there staring through the glass long after he disappeared. Back inside the courtroom, proceedings resumed. But my father's words kept echoing in my head. "No witnesses. You already lost." That night I barely slept. The following morning was scheduled to be the final day of testimony. After that would come closing arguments, then deliberations, then judgment. Everything felt as though it was slipping away. When I arrived at court, Susan was already reviewing notes. She looked tired. The defense looked relaxed. Whitmore even joked with a clerk before proceedings began. Nobody appeared worried, especially not my father. The final witnesses testified. The defense rested. Our side rested. By midday, the evidence phase was effectively over. It felt finished. The atmosphere in the courtroom reflected it. Even spectators seemed convinced the outcome was obvious. Then something unexpected happened. A clerk quietly entered through a side door. At first, nobody paid attention. The clerk approached the judge's bench carrying a worn archive box. The judge frowned. The clerk whispered something. The judge's expression changed. Only slightly. But enough for me to notice. My pulse quickened. Susan noticed too. The box was placed beside the bench. Old, dusty, forgotten. The judge looked down at it for several moments. Then toward the clerk again. I couldn't hear what was being said. Neither could anyone else. Across the room, Whitmore's smile disappeared. Only for a second. But it disappeared. And suddenly, for the first time since the trial began, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Because somewhere inside that archive box, the sealed file my mother had protected all those years ago had finally been found. I've often heard people say that life can change in a single moment. Most of the time that sounds like a cliché. But sitting in that courtroom watching an old archive box being placed beside the judge's bench, I learned that sometimes a single moment really can divide your life into before and after. Nobody in the courtroom knew what was inside. At least most of us didn't. The box itself looked ordinary. Brown cardboard, worn edges, faded labels. The kind of thing you'd overlook in a storage room without a second glance. Yet suddenly it had everyone's attention, especially mine. The judge quietly called both attorneys to the bench. Susan stood. Whitmore stood. The three of them spoke in hushed voices. The rest of us could only watch. My stomach tightened. I glanced toward my father. His expression remained calm, confident, almost bored. The same confidence he had carried throughout the entire trial. The confidence of a man who believed he had already won. After several minutes, the attorneys returned to their tables. The judge adjusted his glasses, then addressed the courtroom. Before we proceed with closing arguments, the court has received archived materials connected to this matter. A murmur spread through the gallery. The judge immediately called for silence. Whitmore stood. Your Honor, the defense objects. The judge looked at him. On what grounds? Whitmore hesitated. Only briefly. But I noticed. The timing is highly unusual. The judge nodded. It is. Then he looked toward the archive box. Nevertheless, the court has an obligation to review relevant evidence. Whitmore sat down. For the first time since the trial began, he appeared uncomfortable. The clerk brought the box forward. The courtroom became so quiet I could hear papers shifting. The judge carefully removed several folders. Most appeared routine. Old filings. Administrative documents. Records. Then he found something different. A sealed envelope. Yellowed with age. Marked with court identification numbers. Protected under an order issued more than 20 years earlier. My pulse was pounding. The judge studied the seal, then slowly opened it. Nobody spoke. Not a single person. He removed the contents. Several pages. Typed. Notarized. Official. At first his expression revealed nothing. He began reading. One page, then another. The room remained silent. I glanced at Susan. She looked just as nervous as I felt. Across the courtroom, Whitmore stared at the judge, unblinking. My father shifted slightly in his chair. The judge turned another page, then suddenly stopped. His eyes fixed on a paragraph near the bottom. Several seconds passed. 5, 10, 15. Nobody moved. The judge read the section again, then a third time. Slowly he removed his glasses. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, and then he whispered 4 words. My God. The words were barely audible. Yet somehow everyone heard them. The effect was immediate. A chill moved through the room. Because judges don't react that way. Not experienced judges. Not people who spend decades hearing difficult cases. The judge sat motionless, still staring at the document. Finally he looked up. Not at me. Not at my father. At Charles Whitmore. The attorney's face had lost color. The judge looked back down, then continued reading. The silence stretched longer. A minute. Maybe more. It felt endless. Finally, the judge set the papers on the bench. His voice was calm. Too calm. Mr. Whitmore. The attorney stood. Yes, Your Honor. Did you personally prepare the trust amendment dated June 14, 2004? Whitmore's expression tightened. Yes. The judge looked at the document again. And you certified its legality? Yes. Nobody understood where this was going. At least not yet. The judge picked up another page. What about the property transfer filed 6 months later? Whitmore swallowed. Yes. The judge nodded slowly, then looked directly at him. Interesting. The word carried a weight that made my skin crawl. Whitmore shifted his feet. The judge continued. This sealed filing contains sworn statements from Margaret Carter, my mother's name. The courtroom stirred. The judge raised a hand for silence. The statements were notarized and submitted under court protection. He paused. They also contained supporting documentation. My heart was hammering. I could barely breathe. The judge turned another page. Then his expression hardened. In all my years, I had never seen a judge look quite like that. Not angry. Not shocked. Something else. Disappointed. The kind of disappointment that comes from discovering something deeply wrong. He looked toward Whitmore again. Counselor. Whitmore didn't answer immediately. Yes, Your Honor. The judge held up a document. This filing indicates that several assets remained legally protected under trust provisions that were never dissolved. The room remained silent. My father leaned forward. The judge continued. It further indicates that later transfer documents directly contradicted court-protected records. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The meaning slowly began sinking in. Then came the next sentence, the sentence that changed everything. This filing also contains correspondence indicating prior knowledge of those contradictions. Whitmore looked as though he might faint. My father turned toward him, confused, alarmed. The judge stared at the attorney. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then the judge said something that sent a wave of fear through the entire courtroom. "Bailiff." The bailiff stepped forward. The judge never took his eyes off Whitmore. "Lock the doors." For a moment, nobody reacted. Then reality hit. The bailiff moved immediately. Heavy courtroom doors closed. Locks clicked. Gasps erupted from the gallery. People looked around in confusion. My father stood halfway from his chair. "What is this?" he demanded. The judge ignored him. Whitmore looked frozen. Completely frozen. Gone was the confident attorney who had dominated the trial. Gone was the polished smile. Gone was the certainty. His face was pale. His hands trembled. And suddenly I understood. Whatever my mother had preserved, whatever truth she had feared might disappear. It was far worse than I had imagined, because this was no longer a dispute about inheritance, no longer a family argument, no longer a civil disagreement. Something criminal had just entered the room, and everyone knew it, especially the man sitting beside my father. The sound of the courtroom doors locking seemed to echo forever. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. For several long seconds, the entire room remained frozen. I looked at my father. The confident smile that had carried him through the trial was gone. For the first time, he looked like an 83-year-old man. Confused, frightened, vulnerable. Charles Whitmore looked even worse. His face had turned completely pale. His eyes never left the judge. The judge adjusted the documents on his bench. Then he spoke. "Mr. Whitmore, I am going to ask you several questions." The attorney swallowed. "Yes, Your Honor. And I strongly advise you to answer carefully." The room felt colder. Whitmore nodded. The judge held up one of the documents from the sealed filing. "This correspondence appears to reference trust assets that were legally protected under court supervision." No response. The judge continued. "It further indicates awareness that subsequent filings conflicted with those protections." Whitmore shifted in his chair. His normally polished confidence had vanished. The judge looked directly at him. "Were you aware of these documents when you prepared later transfer records?" For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Whitmore answered. "My understanding at the time was based on information provided by my client." The answer sounded rehearsed. Weak. The judge wasn't impressed. "That wasn't my question." The silence that followed was painful. Across the room, my father stared at his attorney. A look of uncertainty had replaced years of certainty. The judge ordered a recess. Not the kind of recess people expected. An emergency recess. Court officers entered. Additional legal staff arrived. The atmosphere changed immediately. The case was no longer moving toward closing arguments. Something entirely different was happening. I sat beside Susan while officials quietly moved in and out of the courtroom. Neither of us spoke much. We didn't need to. The situation was speaking for itself. Eventually, Susan leaned toward me. "Daniel." I looked at her. "I think your mother just saved this case." I felt a lump form in my throat. For a moment, I couldn't answer. Because she was right. Years after her death, Mom was still protecting the truth. Several hours later, proceedings resumed. By then, county investigators had already reviewed portions of the sealed material. The judge explained that serious concerns had emerged regarding prior filings connected to trust administration and property transfers. The language was formal, careful, but everyone understood the meaning. Potential fraud. Potential misconduct. Potential criminal exposure. The courtroom audience sat in stunned silence. People who had arrived expecting a routine inheritance dispute were now witnessing something far larger. Then came the moment that changed my father. Until then, he had remained mostly quiet. But when investigators began discussing specific documents, his expression changed. Confusion became concern. Concern became disbelief. Because piece by piece, a picture started emerging. A picture neither of us had fully understood. According to emails recovered from archived records and later subpoenas, Whitmore had repeatedly reassured my father that certain actions were legal, certain transfers, certain amendments, certain filings. The more evidence emerged, the clearer it became that my father had trusted Whitmore completely. Too completely. That realization didn't excuse what my father had done. Not even close. But it complicated the story. Life often does. By late afternoon, Michael was called back to testify. I hadn't expected that. Neither had he. My younger brother looked exhausted. His confidence was gone. The judge questioned him directly about several financial transactions. At first, Michael tried to maintain the same position he had held earlier. Then investigators presented additional records. His shoulders slumped. His voice cracked. And finally he broke. I knew something didn't look right. The courtroom remained silent. Michael stared at the floor. I didn't want to know. The admission hit harder than I expected, because it felt honest, painfully honest. He hadn't created the problem, but he had looked away from it. And sometimes that's enough. The testimony continued. More documents surfaced. More inconsistencies appeared. The story that had protected itself for years began collapsing under its own weight. By the end of the week, state authorities had formally opened an investigation into Whitmore's actions. The once respected attorney left the courthouse through a side entrance surrounded by officials. No cameras, no dramatic handcuffs, just quiet humiliation. In some ways it seemed worse. A lifetime reputation unraveling in public. The community reacted quickly. People who had supported my father suddenly became distant. Others expressed sympathy. Some apologized. A few admitted they had judged me unfairly. I appreciated the kindness, but I wasn't interested in revenge anymore. Not the way I had imagined it. Months earlier, I thought victory would feel satisfying. I imagined standing triumphant while everyone realized I had been right. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Very tired. One afternoon, several weeks after the trial's collapse, the court issued its decision regarding the trust. The ruling restored my legal share of family assets. Several transfers were invalidated. Additional proceedings would continue. But the essential outcome was clear. The truth had finally been recognized. Afterward, I sat alone in my truck for nearly 20 minutes, not celebrating, not smiling, just thinking. Thinking about my mother. Thinking about all the years that had led to that moment. Thinking about how differently everything might have ended if she hadn't preserved those documents. Then my phone rang. It was Michael. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he said something I never expected to hear. I'm sorry, Dan. His voice sounded broken. I should have listened. I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to stay angry. Part of me wanted to remind him of every betrayal, every silence, every excuse. But another part of me heard something genuine. Regret. Real regret. And that was harder to ignore. By then, something inside me had started changing. The trial had exposed lies. But it had also exposed pain. Generations of it. My father had spent years controlling everything around him. Now that control was gone. Whitmore's career was collapsing. The trust was being corrected. The truth was finally public. The fight was ending. Yet somehow the victory didn't feel complete. Because the people involved weren't strangers. They were my family. And despite everything that had happened, that still mattered. The final legal proceedings lasted several more months. Investigators continued examining records. Additional hearings were scheduled. Financial experts reviewed transactions that stretched back decades. The legal system moves slowly, especially when complicated documents and family trusts are involved. But for me, something important had already happened. The truth was no longer buried. For years, I had carried the weight of being dismissed, ignored, treated as though my concerns didn't matter. Now the facts spoke for themselves. Nobody could simply laugh them away anymore. One snowy morning in January, I received a phone call I had been expecting but wasn't prepared for. It was Rebecca, my sister. We hadn't spoken much since the lawsuit began. Like Michael, she had chosen distance. It was easier that way, at least for her. When I answered, her voice sounded hesitant. How are you doing? I almost laughed. After everything that had happened, it felt like a strange place to start. But I understood. Sometimes people don't know how to begin repairing damage, so they start small. We talked for nearly an hour. Not about money, not about court, not about legal documents. We talked about Mom, her cooking, family vacations, Christmas mornings, the things that existed before conflict took over. By the end of the conversation, neither of us had solved anything, yet somehow it felt like progress. A few weeks later, Michael visited my house. It was the first time he had been there in nearly 2 years. The moment felt awkward. 2 aging brothers standing in a driveway, both unsure where to begin. Eventually, Michael shook his head. You know what's funny? I smiled. What? We spent years fighting over things Mom would have hated. Neither of us laughed. Because it was true. We sat at my kitchen table for hours. For the first time in a very long time, we spoke honestly. No lawyers. No accusations. No posturing. Just honesty. Michael admitted he had ignored warning signs. I admitted I had allowed resentment to grow. We talked about Dad. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was necessary. As difficult as those months had been, they forced all of us to confront truths we had avoided for years. And then came the call I never expected. My father wanted to see me. The request arrived through Rebecca. Dad wasn't doing well. Age had finally begun catching up with him. The man who once seemed larger than life now struggled with simple tasks. Part of me didn't want to go. The wounds were still there. The memories hadn't disappeared. Years of favoritism couldn't be erased by a single conversation. But Linda looked at me one evening and quietly said something that stayed with me. "You've spent your whole life wanting him to see you." She paused. "Maybe now he finally does." A week later, I drove to his house. The same house where I had grown up. The same house where so many of those painful memories had begun. Dad was sitting by a window when I arrived. For a moment, I barely recognized him. The confidence, the authority, the stubborn strength. Much of it had faded. Age has a way of stripping away the illusions we spend our lives building. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he motioned toward a chair. I sat down. The silence stretched. Then he surprised me. "I'm sorry." 3 simple words. Words I had waited decades to hear. I stared at him. Not because I didn't understand. Because I wasn't sure I believed what I'd heard. He looked out the window. Not at me. I should have said it years ago. His voice sounded tired. I kept thinking I was protecting the family. He shook his head. But I was protecting my pride. The room felt very still. For the next hour we talked. Really talked. For perhaps the first time in our lives. He admitted things I never expected him to admit. Favoritism. Control. Mistakes. Regrets. Not excuses. Regrets. There is a difference. Nothing he said erased the past. Nothing could. But something important happened that day. The wall between us finally cracked. Not because we agreed on everything. Because we stopped pretending. Several months later, our family gathered at my mother's grave. The first time all of us had stood there together in years. The wind moved gently through the cemetery trees. Nobody spoke much. We didn't need to. Some moments are too important for unnecessary words. I carried the note Mom had left inside that old cookbook. The note that had started everything. After everyone else walked back toward their cars, I stayed behind for a few minutes. I read it again. "If you are reading this, I am gone. There are things I could never prove while I was alive. If you ever need answers, contact Judge Harold Benson. Trust him. Love always, Mom." I folded the paper carefully, then smiled. Because I finally understood something. The greatest gift my mother left wasn't money. It wasn't property. It wasn't an inheritance. It was truth. She knew that without truth, no amount of money could hold a family together. And she was right. The lawsuit restored assets. The investigation exposed wrongdoing. The court corrected records. But those weren't the most important victories. The most important victory was that the lies stopped. The pretending stopped. The silence stopped. And once the truth finally stood in the open, healing could begin. Slowly. Imperfectly. But genuinely. If there's one lesson I carried away from everything that happened, it's this. Justice isn't about destroying people. It's about bringing truth into the light. And once that truth is revealed, every person has a choice. Hold on to bitterness. Or begin the difficult work of forgiveness. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story reminded you of someone you love, someone you've lost, or a truth you've been carrying for years, take a moment to reflect on it. And if you believe stories like this matter, I'd be honored if you shared your thoughts and joined me again for another journey. Because sometimes the stories that stay with us the longest are the ones that remind us what really matters.